Hi, and now we're in week 6 looking at personality disorders. And when we think about this, all of us have a particular style of behavior and ways of relating to one another. Some of us are shy, some are more social, some of us are orderly, and some of us are sloppy. Some of these behavior patterns become inflexible or maladaptive, that they cause significant personal distress or impair functioning in the social or in occupational areas. Their behavior patterns may be diagnosed as a personality disorder. Now, it's important here and I think many of you got it when I read your journals looking at OCD and Howie Mandel, that it's not what you think things are, that there's a higher level of distress, even terror, and it really impacts the way that you can navigate your world. It's not very normal. In fact, it's very abnormal. And that's what we have to look at when we look at all of these disorders, whether they be schizophrenia, panic disorders, OCD, all of them. Probably there's a line that says, here's what I think it is, and here's what it in fact is. And most of us think of it up here. And so personality disorder is the same. We're going to look at types of abnormal behavior patterns involving excessively rigid patterns of behavior or ways of relating with others that ultimately become self-defeating because of the rigidity that prevents adjustment to all sorts of external demands. Okay? So again, when we go through the types, there may be some, I recognize that, and I think I know what that might be. Be more thoughtful, read through the textbook, look at some of those examples, and you'll start to get an idea that, remember, these are things that interrupt, disrupt, and involve all aspects of life that make it difficult to lead what would be you and I, what we would describe as a normal life. So it's not just about being shy or being sloppy or being orderly. It's much more significant and all-encompassing than that. Alrighty? So let's get started with part 1. People with personality disorders do not generally recognize the need to change themselves. Now, there's a couple of points we'll introduce here in the first part of personality disorders and types, and that will be the egosyntonic. These people, their behavior or feelings are perceived as natural and compatible with parts of their sense of self, whereas the ego-dystonic these people have their behaviors and feelings that are perceived to be foreign or alien to to their own sense of self-identity. Now, personality disorders can be organized into 3 clusters, and we're going to look at all 3 clusters. Cluster A, people who are perceived as cold and eccentric. This cluster includes paranoid, schizoid, schizotypal, and disorders as being cluster A. Now, in cluster B, people whose behavior are overly dramatic, emotional, or erratic. Now, this group will consist of the antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. And then lastly, we'll look at cluster 3, which will be people who often appear anxious or fearful. This cluster includes avoidance, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. So let's get started with cluster A. Paranoid personality disorder falls within this cluster A. People with paranoid personality disorder are unduly suspicious, and they're pretty mistrustful of others to the point that their relationships really suffer. They don't hold the more flagrant delusions, if you will, of the typical schizophrenic person. Now, it's characterized by the belief that others are lying, cheating, exploiting, or in some way trying to harm them. A perception of hidden, malicious and meanings and sort of benign comments that aren't really there. It also is characterized by overthinking comments and really analyzing, and always in a negative conclusion. An inability to work with others collaboratively. Emotional detachment, an inability to connect with others, and emotionally numb, even hostile towards others, extremely jealous in some cases. Now, what's important to pay attention about paranoid
personality disorder, and though they seem cold and hostile, we need to remember that they're trying to protect themselves from what they perceive to be constant threats to themselves. Now, they don't see things exactly as you and I do, and that's part of the reason why this is a psychological disorder and not something that we might just, loosely assume that people are out to get us in a sort of inaccurate sort of a manner. Now we'll move to schizoid personality disorder, and it's normal to be reserved about displaying your own feelings, especially among strangers. But people with schizoid personalities rarely express emotions and are distant and aloof, if you will. Schizoid personality disorder describes people who have little interest in social relations, often a restricted range of emotional expression, and appear distant and aloof. It's characterized by extreme introversion, withdrawal. They're not very social, emotionally distant, even from their own close families. They're also not interested in pursuing intimate relationships. They're fixated on their own thoughts and feelings, emotional detachment and emotional numbness. They prefer solitary activities, often include fantasy type activities, which includes some video type games. Now, if we move to the schizotypal personality, it appears to be odd and eccentric in their thoughts and mannerisms and behavior, not to the degree found in schizophrenia. Now, this particular little graph just shows you around what would be some of the differences to sort of separate schizotypal and paranoid and schizoid. Now, it's characterized, that is, the schizotypal is characterized by indifference to and withdrawal from others. Now, this ideas of reference you see in the bottom right-hand corner, it's a form of delusional thinking where they sort of read personal meaning into the behaviors of other people or external events. They aren't existing, but they see meaning in things that doesn't exist. They're not accurate and they're independent of other people. It's almost this sort of magical or psychic thinking that they feel they have, and they see this in everything that's going on around them. The notion that you can influence the behaviors and thoughts of others with your own thinking. Now, odd, elaborate dressing, eccentric is a part of this. Speech is often in metaphors or overly elaborate, somewhat stereotypical where it revolves around certain specific topics. There's a belief that messages are hidden in the public signs, radios, TVs, and advertisements around us. Also an element of suspicion or paranoid ideas. They have inappropriate affect. Now, affect is that sort of, it doesn't seem that their emotional response to the things around them are normal or particularly exaggerated. They're really flat. So when things are happy or sad, they don't seem to have the same emotional, facial, and behavioral response you would expect to see. And there's a lack of close relationships with immediate family. Now we're going to jump into cluster B, and we're going to start with antisocial personality disorder, and then sort of related to this is move into psychopathy, psychopaths, if you will. Now, with antisocial personality disorder, describes people who persistently engage in behavior that violate social norms and the rights of others, and who tend to show no remorse for their deeds. Often characterized by actions that most of us would find unacceptable. Stealing from friends or family, pathological lying almost continuously, manipulating others with no concern for the victims, and no feeling of remorse. Now you'll notice I'm directing your attention to a table 6.2 on page 217 to look at the DSM-5 for some of the characteristics. Now if we move into psychopathy, we're going to touch base on the types of, this is a type of personality pattern that's characterized by affective and interpersonal traits. Now I'll expand on that in a bit. Part of this is about shallow emotions, selfishness, arrogance, superficial charm, deceitfulness, manipulative, irresponsibility, sensational seeking, and lack of empathy, anxiety, or even remorse, combined with, a persistent violation of social norms, a social deviant and almost nomadic lifestyle, and impulsivity. Now I've pulled up 3 people here. Ted Bundy is in the left there. He was a serial killer from back in the 70s. Very charming, very engaging with people, but of course he was a serial killer. He wasn't perceived to be that way. He even defended himself in court. He had that sense of, ability, he felt. Jeffrey Dahmer, the bottom picture, also a serial killer, wasn't particularly charming, but he was engaging enough with people to get them to come to his apartment so that he could kill them and store them and eat them. Now, Bernie Madoff, the gentleman on the right, isn't himself a serial killer or even killed anybody, but he is a person who, I believe it was in the neighborhood of $90 million he absconded from people in a Ponzi scam. Most of were his friends and family. He didn't have any remorse about it. He was charged, he was put in prison, but he's never returned the money at all. Now, not all criminals show signs of psychopathy, and only a minority of people with psychopathic personalities become criminals. Many psychopaths are law-abiding and quite successful in their chosen occupations. They possess a personality style characterized by callous disregard of the interests and feelings of others. Now, psychological and biological factors are associated with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathology, and there's 4 sort of areas we'll pay attention to. A lack of emotional responsiveness. Now, part of this is related to the galvanized skin response, where their responses on that system are lower than most others. They lack anxiety when in stressful situations. Now, like it was mentioned, that's sometimes good. I want somebody who's got a real good handle on their anxiety and can manage stressful situations. If I have a brain aneurysm and someone's going to operate on my brain, I don't want someone jiggling all over the place with anxiety and stress. The craving for stimulation, well, this is the optimal level of arousal that people would be looking for. And they may need higher than normal arousal to maintain what is an optimum level to be successful. It's not always bad. Like I said, astronauts going out to space want to be able to manage their anxiety and stress in a particularly positive way. So that level of stress, if you will, or stimulation for them is what they need to sort of get into, if you will, a good working environment. Now, again, we don't label all people in those roles as being psychopaths, because that's just not the case. Okay? Now, the other is the lack of restraint or on impulsivity. Lower levels of activity in the frontal lobes inhibits impulsive behaviors. The 4th area is this limbic abnormality. Psychopaths engage in criminal activity may have lower activity in the emotional processing areas of the brain. Now, what I've done is I've posted in week 6 2 videos by Dr. Dutton on psychopathy. You might find them interesting. One's a little shorter than the other. The one that is on the interview, you may not hear the questions very well, but Dr. Dutton does sort of respond in a manner that you'll understand what's being expressed. I hope you enjoy them. Continuing on with Cluster B, borderline personality disorder is defined in terms of instability in self-image, relationships, and mood. People with borderline personality disorder tend to be uncertain about their values, goals, loyalties, career, choices in friends, and perhaps even sexual orientation. They tend to engage in impulsive acts and are frequently self-destructive. They have difficulty controlling emotions and or impulses. They frequently engage in dramatic changes in moods, opinions, and plans. They have a history of involving in frequent and intense arguments, possibly physical fights. They fear being alone despite the tendency to push people away. Feelings of emptiness, very unstable in their relationships and their moods. Moving into histrionic, we can see in terms of the cluster B of this is people with histrionic personality disorder are characterized by excessive needs to be the center of attention and to receive a reassurance, praise, and approval from others. Such persons often appear overly dramatic and emotional in their behavior. It's characterized by a tendency to be overly dramatic, seems to be acting. The term histrionic refers to a person who is theatrical in manner, excessive sensitivity to the approval of others, attention grabbing, often sexually provocative, clothing and behavior. Attention seeking is not always good attention. Bad attention is better than none. Needs to be the center of attention. Excessive concern for physical appearance. A false sense of intimacy with others, believes that everyone loves them, and oftentimes people find them irritating. Constant, sudden emotional shifts, very social and extroverted, but very self-absorbed. Now this next grouping, within cluster B, this next psychological disorder is often misunderstood, and I've put some graphics in that represent the misunderstanding. Narcissistic personality disorder. Now we often understand it to be something a little different or not exclusive to what it is represented. Whereas in the narcissistic personality disorder, we have inflated or grandiose sense of self. And like those with histrionic personalities, they demand to be the center of attention. Now the misunderstanding is it's about self-love and your constant attention given to yourself and that you love yourself. And it's partly true, but it's not characterized by that exclusively. It's in fact characterized by a sense of, or an inflated sense of, and preoccupation with your own self-importance, achievements, and talents. So it's not just being this perception of being in love with yourself, but having this preoccupation with your own self-importance, constant attention-grabbing and admiration-seeking behavior. Unlike histrionic personality disorder, a person with narcissistic personality disorder looks only for positive attention, excessive anger or shame in response to criticism about what they are or who they are, manipulation of others to further their own desires, a belief that they are special or unique, a preoccupied with fantasies of power, brilliance, recognition, and often envious of other people and believe that others are envious of them. So it's not just about being in love with themselves. They can, perhaps, someone might be really extending and overextended their help to other people, and they might view themselves as the best helper there is. And that could still, within the category of narcissism, fall within that disorder. All right, let's move into cluster C, not 3, but C. Cluster C, we're looking at personality disorders that are characterized by anxiousness and fearful behavior. And we're going to start with the avoidant personality disorder, which describes people who are so terrified of rejection and criticism that they are generally unwilling to enter relationships without unusually long reassurances of acceptance. It's characterized by hypersensitivity to criticism or rejection, a self-imposed social isolation, extreme shyness in social situations, though it's strongly desired to have a close relationship, longing to be accepted, but will do anything to avoid being criticized. Now again, I have to, sort of couch all of these disorders with, often we will all have bits and pieces of this as a part of who we are on a day-to-day or even a month-to-month type of basis. The difference is how much it interferes with our ability to do what we want to do with our lives. And I would just ask you to, to remember again about Howie Mandel's video on OCD, that how much we misunderstand what it is and the effect it can have on our lives. And it's the same for these sorts of disorders we're talking about today. We're going to move to dependent personality disorder, where people with dependent personality disorder are overly dependent on other people and have extreme difficulty acting independently or making even the smallest decisions on their own. It's very similar to avoidant personality disorder, the main difference being that there is a distinct dependee upon whom the person is dependent for personality disorder and will attach. The movie What About Bob is a good example of what, in a humorous sort of a manner, dependent personality disorder may look like. Now, I have to emphasize this is a stereotypical view, and it's done as a comedy, not necessarily as something more realistic. Excessive dependence on others, usually a specific person, to meet the physical or emotional needs of that individual. They have poor tolerance or poor or even abusive treatment in order to stay in relationship. They'll tolerate all sorts of negatives in order to be in that relationship. And there's an unwillingness to be independently voice opinion or to make a decision or initiate activities. They really have a difficult time taking that on themselves. Continuing with cluster 3, we'll look at obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is not the same as obsessive compulsive disorder. That's an anxiety-based psychological disorder. This is a personality disorder. And here, people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder have various traits such as orderliness, perfection, rigidity, and the overall attention to detail, but without the true obsessions and compulsions associated with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is anxiety-based. So this is characterized by excessive concern for order, rules, schedules, lists, perfectionism, often so pronounced that they can't complete tasks because the standards are impossible to meet. And so it's not just wanting things in order, it has to produce the kind of distress that even though they are in order, they're not perfect, because perfection is not attainable. And so this persistence, this preoccupation is what is personality or obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The inability to throw out even broken and worthless objects, the inability to share the responsibility with other people, inflexibility about ideas, beliefs, methods. This is the right way to do it, period. Compulsive devotion to work at the expense of recreation and at the expense of relationships, financial stinginess, a discomfort with emotions and other aspects of a close personal relationship since they cannot be controlled and structured. Now there is, and I'm sure you can imagine with some of these classifications, that there could be some problems with classifications. There's various controversies and problems attended to the classification of personality disorders. They include a lack of demonstrated reliability and validity. Now, if you remember from chapter 1, we looked at what is reliability and validity. And so some of the issues associated with what is reliability and validity apply to, are all the classifications reliable and valid? There's too much overlapping among categories, and I'm sure that you've noticed that in some of the categorizations that we've looked at, that they seem to be related or similar in some aspects to others, and that's part of the problems with classification. Difficulty in distinguishing between variations in normal behavior and abnormal behavior. Because a lot of this is on like a continuum, and so there is at one end of the continuum completely lacking certain things, and at the other end having an extraordinary amount of other things, normal being somewhere in the middle, it does make it difficult to see that relationship. And it makes it difficult to make that distinguishing between what is normal and what is abnormal. And lastly, there's an underlying sexist bias in certain categories, and confusions of labels with explanations. Now, the sexist bias is a lot of the research that's been done over a lot of the years have been done by men on men, as opposed to explaining how there might be differences between the expression for women and the expression for men. Now, this last slide, it's somewhat of a humorous perspective, but also just a helpful way to make a distinguishing difference between how do you sort of separate the different personality disorders. And it's the use of a parking lot to sort of describe how might we see these different personality disorders. So I hope you found this particular helpful. This is looking at types of personality disorders. It's part 1, and I'll move you on to part 2 and part 3, looking at theories and looking at treatment in the next 2 videos. I hope you're enjoying your semester. Keep up the good work, everybody. Bye now.